it's interesting as developers, we're constantly caught between two things that we love. One is things that just work, and the other is the desire to be able to configure and twiddle every knob with software that we have. And so those are two kind of opposed problems.
Hi everyone, you're listening to Scaling DevTools, the show that investigates how DevTools go from 0 to 1. I'm joined today by Alan Shreve, who is the founder and CEO of NGrok. And NGrok is online in one line. They help you deploy your apps incredibly efficiently, which I'll talk about in a minute. But Alan, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me here, Jack. It's a pleasure to be on and talking to you.
Thank you. And before we kind of dig in, I wanted to share how I discovered NGrok for everyone, just because I think it's such an amazing tool, and the way that I discovered it was cool. So I was working with a video API at Marks, and I wanted to test out webhooks to see when my video had uploaded. And when you're running this in localhost, there's no way to kind of pass your URL to receive the data when you receive a notification when your video is uploaded. But they recommended that I use NGrok. And once you install NGrok, you can just go NGrok HTTP 3000, and your app is actually online in the web. Your local host is online, and if you save your file, it updates, and it's really unbelievable. And it was one of those moments where it was just like, wow, that's like magic. And I've been kind of an unpaid advocate of NGrok ever since. So I'm really excited to speak with you today, Alan. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about how you arrived at this amazing tool.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really common discovery path for NGrok that you mentioned. A lot of folks find us through various different documentation. Mux is an example, but we are embedded in docs for GitHub, Atlassian, Microsoft, kind of all over the tech ecosystem, because NGrok really enables the usage of that webhook piece, especially webhook development. NGrok has found its way into those pieces of documentation.
Yeah, that's amazing. And how did you, and I know this is something Keith, your colleague Keith, is very passionate about as well, is how do you kind of create such a simple experience? Because I imagine it didn't start out so simple at the beginning.
That's a really good question. Simplicity is something that we think about a lot at NGrok, and something that we focus on. When I think about it, there are a number of kind of famous, often misattributed sayings that kind of revolve around simplicity. Things like I would have written a shorter letter if I had more time, or Exupery's quote about perfection is achieved when you can't remove anything else. Those are really good directionally about thinking directionally about how simplicity is a tremendous amount of work to achieve, right? You spend a lot of time thinking about what is truly important, what is most important to a user experience, and then trying to pull away all of the other pieces of it. It's interesting as developers, we're constantly caught between two things that we love. One is things that just work, and the other is the desire to be able to configure and twiddle every knob with software that we have. And so those are two kind of opposed problems of something that just works versus something that you can configure in every way. As a designer of those products, it's especially challenging because we talk a lot about, well, how do we solve the 90% use case? That's, if you solve the 90% use case, you've built something, maybe you can keep it simple, right? By ignoring the complexities of that additional 10%. But the other saying that is especially true for developers is that that 10%, everyone's 10% is different, right? Of like what they want to configure inside of your tool or your application. And so you have to make all of the things configurable. When you like boil it down to like, well, given that problem space, you have folks who want to configure all the different pieces of your application, but you want to deliver something that is really simple and really delivers that magic moment that you experienced with NGrok, where you ran a single command, you imported a single line of code, and your application was online. You're really thinking about what are the choices that you can make as a product designer, as a API designer, that you're taking each of those knobs that you can configure and trying to decide like what is the sanest default that I can find for them, or how can I delay that decision so that you can configure it, but you don't have to upfront, right? That I've made this sane choice for you, but it can be changed later. Building that kind of flexibility and flow into your app is certainly challenging. There are a lot of decisions that you make about what to default someone to that may not be the right for everyone. But that is really the product design struggle, and trying to like put all these things together is finding that simple interface, and either removing unnecessary choices or delaying choices that you can find sane defaults for.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I wonder if there's like with that particular kind of like the online in one line, was that something that, how did that kind of emerge? Like, do you remember the kind of conversations internally and stuff?
So NGrok was originally a solo project, so there weren't a whole lot of like internal conversations when the product was like the very first iterations of the product were being developed. But lately we've expanded upon that initial tool set, where originally NGrok was a binary that you downloaded and ran on your machine that provided you with that connectivity. And we're now starting to expand to a place where you can import NGrok directly into your application. You don't actually have to run a separate executable. Instead, you can import a library and basically add a single line of code that does the same thing that running the executable will do, which is give you something that puts your app online. But the thing that it returns to you is a socket, right? Something that looks and feels like a native socket object in the language that you're using. And so we had a lot of conversations about that, about, internally, of how do we make that as simple as the developer tool that we built? How do we think about, what are the interfaces that we have to implement? How can we collapse this into as few lines of code as possible? And that was definitely an internal struggle, right? Between us saying, well, if we make it more lines of code, you can add more configuration. So like, how do we boil it down to like the simplest piece that covers the majority use case?
Yeah. And how did you, like, what was it? Lots of conversations and then just made a decision, or how did you?
It's definitely an iterative process, right? Where, we have a lot of that DNA baked into the organization about creating these simple interfaces. And so that was directionally where we were starting from. But actually getting there is certainly a challenge, where, you like the first APIs that we proposed for, our NGrok Go SDK that we just released, and the new ones that we're working on right now, which are NGrok Rust and NGrok JS. The first versions of those were, APIs that we designed and we implemented them and said, like, that's not exactly right. Like, let's try it again and again and again, and iterated those things down. And the other half of it that we found, especially with library design, is two things, really. One is, one of the best ways to test your library is to actually use it, right? Like, become a consumer of it. And so when you take those kind of pieces and actually build on top of them yourselves, you really start to feel the pain that a developer would in like, starting to integrate it. It's different, of course, in that you kind of like know how the library works underneath. You like know all the sharp corners and edges. But we do find that's one good way to pressure test those designs. And the other is really to go out to the community, right? And like talk to folks and offer them first versions of them and get them to try to integrate them into their apps and gather feedback and iterate on the design there as well. So it is by no means like a one and done sort of thing. Definitely not like a place where we like started off and we're like knew the exact solution to begin with, but one where we've arrived through constant iteration. And I would say that, you know, our designs for those are still not done, right? Like they will continue to evolve. And that's, you know, one of the beautiful pieces of software is that you can continuously evolve, you know, your designs to make them more elegant.
Yeah, that makes sense. And kind of probably be dropping like 5 names here, but Keith shared an article from Swix, who's been on the show before, where Joel Spolsky was talking about Amazon's one-click, and how Jeff Bezos, 4 names, was trying to kind of implement the one-click checkout, and how the team kept coming back with like 4 clicks and then 3 clicks and then 2 clicks, and Jeff Bezos was like one click. And just to implement this, they had to build like a whole new system where there was like a 30-minute cooldown period, and it was really easy to edit your order and stuff like that. And I just wondered about like how much creating these kind of really simple systems, whether it's like, you know, not only like a decision of where you focus, but also like a lot of extra work to kind of create that simplicity.
Yeah, I've watched that clip. It's really great. It's a really good encapsulation of that iterative process that I was talking about of like chasing that simplicity. It's interesting to draw that line between the simplicity of the user interface and the complexity of the system that implements it, right? Because that's really what makes NGrok and Amazon's one-click feel so magical, is that simple interface to the complex system that we've built. NGrok is a really good example of that, in that, you know, when you run that one line or you import that one, you know, library and add that one line of code to your application, you know, the things that are going on underneath the hood to actually deliver that is, you know, a large complex system where, you know, when you run your application and ask it to listen on NGrok, it is connecting to essentially like all of our global points of presence and all transmitting configuration requirements to them. And they are all like reloading in real time to basically push your configuration out to our global edge. The infrastructure to run that, the software to make that happen, you know, and feel instantaneous, is by no means simple to implement. But it is really joyful to create that magical experience, right, where you hide all of that complexity.
Yeah, it is amazing. And I'm just kind of wondering, because on the surface, I feel like everyone would agree with you. You know, like, okay, simplicity is really important. You've got to get the right balance between simplicity and complexity. But it's pretty clear to me, like, that you're a lot further down that path than most developer tools. And I just kind of wondered, like, if there is any kind of like specific things that you do internally that like that other dev tools might learn from and kind of try to, you know, to kind of get to that place.
That's a good question. I think, you know, predominantly it is a mentality. It is, you know, there are product processes that you can put into place that will help you chase that simplicity. But you really do have to have, you know, that kind of like Jeff Bezos, Steve Jobs like position, right? Of saying like this has to be simple, right? We have to find the minimal interface to begin with. And a lot of it falls out from that intention, I would say.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's like the cultural like importance that you put upon it across the whole organization.
Yeah, exactly. It's something that we measure and track internally. Like one of the things that we measure and track internally is, essentially like time to value between when someone signs up to NGrok and they are able to essentially like start NGrok, like start an application that is listening on NGrok and receive traffic. That's a metric that we track. It's a KPI that we think about, um, and we're really proud that we have folks that basically like sign up for the product and have it working in 30 seconds. Like that's an incredible it's an incredible feat. For us, we're like really, and we're constantly thinking about like how do we push that lower, or how do we get, the long tail of folks who are, in minutes or hours, like how do we bring them down to that 30 seconds? Yeah. So I don't know. That's one way that we think about it.
Yeah, that's really cool. And so I guess I'm using it mostly as like I'm a free customer at the moment, because I'm mostly like working on hobby projects, trying to get something off the ground. And I'm using it kind of as a solo person, and it's been amazing. And I just wondered how do you kind of think about users like me, or similar users, and like how do they become people that pay, people that have like whole teams and that sort of thing?
Yeah. There are two ways to think about that. One is, uh, we we absolutely love folks who are using the product like you, who are using it for personal projects and doing small development use cases. Our mission at NGrok is to empower developers. We want to make developers more successful, more easier for them to do their job. And going back to what we were talking about earlier, is we are trying to create that simplicity, that abstraction around networking, that application developers shouldn't have to think about these low-level networking bits to actually get their jobs done, right? Um, More than that, there's a whole like slew of things that we can take off your plate, that we can potentially like implement for you, in that kind of proxy layer, so that you're able to like actually skip to writing the business logic. So the one really short answer is we love free tier users, free tier developers who are building on top of the platform. It's really meaningful to us to like see that usage, understand how folks are using the platform, because ultimately, regardless of whether you're paying or not, like you have the same kind of like developing problems, right? So all of those like feed into the product process of understanding like what people are doing and how can we make the product better. The other half of that question is like how does like a hobbyist use case like expand into something that is commercial or paid? Um, there are kind of like two directions that goes. One is just sheer usage, right? You're using so much of the product that our free tier has some set of like reasonable limits around how much of the resources of our platform that you can use. And so commercial use cases often have like higher resource usage, and that like will kick you into some kind of paying tier. The other is there are some set of when you're using the developer tool as a hobbyist, this is kind of like part of NGrok's like product-led growth strategy, right? Is that maybe you're using just a small corner of things, but you don't need to put SAML in front of your hobbyist use case, your hobbyist tier, right, or your personal project. But that it's there, right? You've like seen the capabilities that the platform has offered, and understand that if you were to use this in a commercial way, like you have a problem to solve at your job, that you're aware that NGrok can help you out there. And so that's another way that we've seen a lot of folks jump into the commercial offerings, is that they've been using NGrok at home, are aware that it can essentially like that same magic moment that you have for solving your personal problems, your webhook development thing, is we endeavor and strive to have that same magic moment for putting production applications on the internet as well. And, making that jump from free to commercial is often about being aware of that and like finding the use case at work, in your job or in commercial life in general, and translating it, saying like, oh, I know that NGrok, really solved that one problem. Like, let's see if it can solve another problem really easily.
Yeah, that makes sense. And how do you think about like the problems that NGrok solves? Because it seems like there's so many paths that you can kind of go.
Yeah, I would say that where NGrok is focused as a company, right, where we're really taking the product is in a direction where NGrok is focused on solving the problem of putting applications online, creating network ingress to applications. We talk about NGrok being a ingress-as-a-service platform, and that means that we are solving that problem of how do I put my application on the internet, right? And there are many additional problems that come with putting your application on the internet. Like the sheer problem of connectivity is one that is, I would say, like somewhat relatively well solved, but it actually isn't. When you think about actually like putting something on the internet, these days it is IP addresses and DNS and TLS certificates and often like ingress and egress gateways and VPC, like elastic IP associations, right? There's a whole mess of things that are actually required, which, we talk internally about all of those problems being that developers are, when it comes to networking, are still really working with like the assembly language of networking. We haven't built the right abstractions for application developers to work with the networking primitives. And so we're still like stuck using these very low level primitives to solve this much higher layer problem, this higher layer job that we really want to solve. So, NGrok's job, our platform, is thinking about how do we take those low level primitives and create this abstraction layer on top. That really solves the problem in an easy way. So, like I said, one of those is just pure connectivity, which is somewhat solved, but is still harder than it needs to be. And then a set of additional problems that we really think about solving on top, which are how do I add authentication to my application, right? I only want a certain set of people to access the application. Or how do I observe the application? I want to see all the traffic that's routing to it. Or how do I protect the application from attacks or from accidental like overloads, or the application is down? And so building a lot of those primitives into NGrok's essentially like proxy layer that allows us to solve those problems for application developers with very minimal configuration on their own. That's, that fits into our overall mission of how do you get an application online.
That's really cool. Yeah. So it's like you're just essentially letting developers just write business logic, and then everything on the kind of online plus like scale and authentication and security, all of that will be kind of easily assembled or solved.
That's really, the direction that we're pointing NGrok in. We want it to be like that kind of like powered like mech suit of armor that you like drop your application into and it gets superpowers. Another way to think about this is, we want application developers to focus on building applications, right? And not on solving rate limiting and concurrency limiting and a whole bunch of other things that you have to do to like put your application online. One of the things that we talk about internally is, and this is maybe like part of that mentality we were talking about earlier, is, how do we allow a developer to like build something over the weekend at a hackathon and put NGrok in front of it and go to production on Monday, right? Of like be able to sell it to businesses or to consumers on Monday. And there are a lot of challenges that, that are required to get there. or a lot of challenges to solve in order to get there. But directionally, that's kind of how we think about solving this problem and where we want to take the product.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. That would be incredible. Yeah, it's all the fun stuff. Developers still do all the fun stuff, and then you take care of the rest.
It all depends on what you think is the fun
That's
stuff.
True.
This is the fun stuff for us, right?
Yeah. True. Yeah, poorly phrased. Yeah, that's really cool. And one of the things that we've been asking people recently, because we're probably coming to the end of our time, is what takeaway you would have for other developer tool founders, people working at dev tools that you think NGrok has learned.
I mean, following up on our theme here today, I would say that one of the things that we've learned that I would that I love talking about with other folks is about that effort and that drive for creating simplicity of like finding the right abstraction and understanding that it really truly is an iterative process, that you really spend a lot of time but on getting there, and the important piece is that like directional alignment of like that's the thing that you're really chasing after.
Yeah, that makes sense. And if people want to learn more about NGrok, or they want to hear what you're up to, where can they learn more?
Yeah, it's just ngrok.com. That'll take you to our website where you can or follow our blog, which is blog.ngrok.com. Has all of the announcements of all the things that we're working on and shipping to the world.
Okay, amazing.
Yeah, I mean, the things that we've like launched recently that we're really most excited about are our kind of like native SDKs. I talked about these a little bit earlier, which is this ability to embed NGrok directly into your application and get something that looks like a socket object that you can just include directly into a piece of software that already like works with the native networking primitives in the languages that you use. We're really excited about that concept of allowing you to, instead of listening on a port, you listen on all of NGrok's global network, but from your application's perspective, it is just as if it listened on a local port. We think this is going to like further increase NGrok's simplicity, especially when you're deploying applications out to the world, that you don't have to package NGrok alongside of your application. It is like that networking capability is just embedded directly into it. So that's one thing that we're super excited about. The other that we just launched today actually is we moved a couple of those security primitives that I was talking about earlier about how NGrok allows you to wrap authentication around your app. We moved a couple of those security primitives into the free tier. We're on a mission to make sure that when you put applications out into the world that those applications should be secured, right? And so we've added the capability to basically seamlessly put any kind of OAuth you want in front of the application, as well as a really common use case that you were talking about earlier, which is consuming webhooks. We have the ability for you to essentially like supply NGrok with the webhook signing secret from a given provider, and it will run those signature validation routines essentially at our global edge before any traffic would come back to your application. So we're really excited to offer those security primitives out to the world and really like start making all the applications that are exposing themselves to the world more secure by using those primitives for authentication.
Yeah, amazing. And thanks everyone for listening. Thanks so much for joining, Alan. As you know, big fan of NGrok, so this was really exciting. And I hope everyone forgives me for being such a fan of NGrok on the show. It's been awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for all the great questions, Jack. It's been really a pleasure being here and speaking with you.
Thanks. And thanks everyone for listening, and see you next week. Oh, and thank you, Keith, for organizing. Thanks. Bye.